cemetery was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that pressed against the skin and made every sound sharper. Wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of wet earth and cut grass. Marble headstones caught the pale light of the sun, standing in neat rows like soldiers frozen in place. It was a place meant for peace, but the air carried something else, something heavy, like grief that refused to leave. Among the graves was one freshly kept, the stone polished as if it were cleaned every day, flowers laid carefully at its base. It belonged to a young man who had once lived in the glow of money and privilege, but whose story had ended far too soon. The woman who visited it often was not just a grieving mother. She was a figure everyone in the city knew. Her name carried power. Her face was seen on magazine covers, her name linked to wealth and influence. Yet here, standing before the grave of her only son, none of that mattered. She carried herself with the elegance of someone who had built walls against the world, but those walls always cracked when she was here. The loss had carved something deep into her, something no amount of money could fill. On the surface, her life had always seemed untouchable. She was born into money, married into more of it, and after her husband's death, her empire only grew. Mansions, companies, political ties. She had them all. But wealth, for all its power, could not save her son. That fact haunted her, made her question the very things she had once believed unshakable. She never spoke about it publicly, never allowed the cameras to capture her tears, but in this cemetery, her pain was laid bare. Her son's life had been complicated, though many never knew it. To the world, he was the golden boy, charming, handsome, and destined to inherit a legacy that stretched across industries. But behind closed doors, there were sear, racks. His relationship with his mother had been strained at times, weighed down by expectations, power, and the invisible pressure of living in someone else's shadow. He had wanted freedom, but freedom is hard to find when your name is tied to a dynasty. There were arguments, nights he stayed out too long, choices that worried her, but also moments of tenderness when he reminded her that he was still her boy. On the day he died, the world seemed normal. Nothing had warned her that by evening her life would be shattered. The details of that day were still stitched into her memory, and no matter how hard she tried, she could never stop replaying them. The call that came, the rush to the hospital, the cold sterility of the room where she saw him lying still. It was the moment her world, no matter how rich or powerful, came undone. And yet, standing by his grave, she wasn't alone. At first, she thought she was. The cemetery rarely had visitors at this hour, but as she moved closer to the headstone, she saw a figure, small, fragile, hunched forward. A young woman in a faded uniform dress, the kind worn by waitresses at diners. Her shoulders shook as she cried softly, her hand clutching the tiny fingers of a child who stood at her side. The child, no more than 3 or 4, stared down at the flowers with wide, solemn eyes. It was strange, almost unreal to see them there. The billionaire's first thought was confusion. Who were they? And why were they at her son's grave? The woman's tears were not quiet, not the kind of polite grief offered by strangers. They were raw, heavy, the kind of crying that came from knowing loss, not witnessing it from afar. The child clung to her leg, shifting uneasily as if sensing the weight of what his mother felt. The billionaire stood frozen, her heart quickening in her chest. There was something in the young woman's presence that unsettled her, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made the ground beneath her feel unstable. She had expected solitude, a moment to speak to her son in silence, but instead she found a stranger who seemed to know him too well. And it was then, as the waitress raised her head and their eyes met, that the first chill of truth brushed against her. There was recognition in the woman's gaze, as if her grief carried a secret, one that connected her to the grave in a way the billionaire could not yet understand. It was only the beginning. but already the sense of normalcy was unraveling. Because beneath the polished surface of wealth and the quiet sorrow of a mother, there were hidden stories of love, betrayal, mistakes, and power. The kind of stories that never made it to the newspapers but lived in whispers, in choices made in shadows. And now, in the most unexpected place, those stories were about to come crashing into the open. The wind stirred again, carrying with it the fragile petals from the flowers at the grave. The billionaire's hand tightened against her coat. Something told her that what she was about to learn would change everything she thought she knew, not just about her son, but about herself. The billionaire could not take her eyes off the young woman standing at her son's grave. There was something almost unbearable about the way the waitress held herself. Shoulders bent, hair falling loose, her face streaked with tears that looked too personal to belong to a stranger. And then there was the boy, a small child with wide, searching eyes that seemed to hold a truth far older than his years. He clung to her hand as if afraid she might fall apart. The billionaire felt her chest tighten. She wanted to ask who they were, why they were her, but the words stuck. Her voice, always strong and commanding in boardrooms and interviews, betrayed her now. It was the waitress who finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I didn't know you'd be here today," she whispered. Her words dropped like stones in the silence, as though she had spoken them before, as though there was already a history between them. The billionaire stiffened. The waitress knew her. More than that, she spoke with familiarity, as if she had known her son too. The child looked up at the grave, then at the billionaire, his small lips parting as though he wanted to say something but didn't know how. The mother's heart lurched. It began there, with a moment of recognition that cut through the stillness like a blade. In the days that followed, questions refused to leave her mind. Who was the child? Why did the waitress grieve as if she had lost someone she loved? Every visit to the grave became more strained. Sometimes the waitress was there, sometimes not, but her presence lingered like a shadow. The billionaire could no longer stand by the headstone without feeling watched, without feeling that something had been kept from her. She ordered her people to find out who the waitress was. Within days, reports came back. Her name was Elise, 27 years old, worked at a diner in the poorer side of the city, struggled to pay rent, often picked up double shifts, and lived with her mother in a cramped two-bedroom apartment. But what struck the billionaire hardest wasn't in the files. It was the photograph attached. Elise holding her child, smiling faintly, the boy's dark curls pressed against her cheek. There was something hauntingly familiar in that child's eyes, something she had seen before. In her son, the thought festered, gnawed at her. Could it be? She wanted to dismiss it, to tell herself she was imagining things, but deep down she knew. The truth was there, staring back at her in the child's face. The next time she saw Elise, she confronted her. Her words were sharp, colder than she intended. "Tell me the truth. That boy, was he my son's?" Elise froze, her face pale, her arms instinctively pulling the child close. For a moment, she looked like a cornered animal. And then, almost in a whisper, she said yes. The world seemed to tilt. Rage and sorrow crashed together inside the billionaire. Her son had hidden this from her. He had lived a double life she hadn't known. Elise had carried his child in silence, raising him in poverty, while her own family sat in wealth beyond measure. The injustice of it burned. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but Elise's eyes held a defiance that silenced her. "It wasn't your place to know," Elise said, her voice steadier now. "He wanted to protect us. He knew what your world would do to me." The words cut deep. Protect us, from her. The billionaire had always prided herself on control, on keeping her family untouchable, but now she was painted as the enemy. She told herself that Elise was ungrateful, even manipulative, but beneath the anger, there was guilt. She remembered her son's restless nights, his silences at family dinners, his sudden outbursts. Maybe he had been carrying this secret all along. Tension thickened each time they met. The billionaire demanded to see the child, to be part of his life. But Elise refused. "He's my son," she said firmly. "Not yours." Those words lit a fire in the billionaire, who had never been told no, not in her entire life. She began to press harder, offering money, promises of a better life for the boy. Elise rejected every offer, insisting she didn't want his childhood bought. Behind the scenes, the billionaire's lawyers drafted documents, preparing custody petitions. She told herself she was doing this for the child, for her grandson, to give him a life of opportunity. But another part of her, darker, unspoken, wanted to claim what was hers, what her son had left behind. Elise, meanwhile, grew more desperate. Rumors spread at the diner where she worked. Whispers that she was involved with the billionaire's family, that the child wasn't hers alone. Friends warned her that she was playing with fire, that the wealthy didn't fight fair. She carried her son to bed at night, kissing his forehead with trembling lips, terrified that someone might take him from her. The strain pushed Elise into corners she never expected. Bills piled up, her hours were cut, and yet she refused the billionaire's help. Pride mixed with fear. If she took the money, she'd lose all control. She began keeping a journal, writing about the late-night phone calls her son had made, the promises he whispered to her before his death. In her words, she held on to him and on to the truth of the life they shared in secret. For the billionaire, the waiting grew unbearable. Her lawyers advised patience, but she wasn't used to patience. She pressed her contacts, pulled strings in the courts, whispered in the ears of people who owed her favors. Elise was cornered on every side. Letters came in the mail threatening legal action. Strangers began watching her apartment, men in suits who lingered too long near her door. Fear wrapped itself around her until she could barely breathe. And yet she fought back. Her love for her son's child gave her a strength that surprised even herself. She called out the billionaire in public one afternoon, standing outside the gates of her mansion with the child in her arms, reporters gathering as she shouted, "He is mine! He belongs with me!" Cameras flashed, headlines spread, and for the first time, the billionaire's perfect image cracked. The world saw not just a grieving mother, but a woman willing to crush the poor to keep her legacy intact. The battle lines had been drawn. Each woman carried her own wounds. The billionaire, with her grief and pride, refused to be excluded from her grandson's life. Elise, with her fear and love, refused to surrender the only piece of her late lover she had left. But beneath their struggle, darker currents moved. Secrets about the son's death began to surface, whispers that it hadn't been an accident after all, that money and power had buried truths no one dared speak. Elise had always suspected there was more to it, and now, with the billionaire pressing against her, she wondered if she was closer to danger than she realized. The city buzzed with gossip. Two women, one rich and powerful, the other poor and defiant, locked in a battle over a child who carried the blood of both. Every meeting between them grew more heated, words sharpening into weapons, threats turning into promises neither could take back. And in the heart of it all was the boy, caught in a storm he couldn't understand. He clung to his mother at night, asking why the lady in black kept coming around, asking why she cried when she looked at him. Elise had no answer. The billionaire, alone in her mansion, stared at her son's photograph and whispered promises to the child she believed was hers by right. The tension had become unbearable. Two women bound by one man, by one child, by grief and pride and power, wooed. They're on a collision course, and the deeper they sank into their fight, the clearer it became. This was no longer just about love or justice. It was about control, about who would own the future, about who would be left standing when the dust settled. The night the crime unfolded began quietly. almost too quietly, as though the city itself held its breath. Rain had been falling since late afternoon, coating the streets in slick black, the kind of night where neon signs blurred into watery reflections and footsteps echoed too loud against empty sidewalks. Elise had just finished a late shift at the diner, her hands sore from carrying trays, her body heavy with exhaustion. She clutched her son's small hand as they walked the short distance to the apartment. The boy was half asleep, his curls damp from the mist, his tiny voice mumbling questions she barely had the energy to answer. What she didn't know was that across town, the billionaire was spiraling. The court case she had been promised would turn in her favor had stalled. Judges hesitated, public sympathy leaned toward Elise, and the press had painted her as a grieving mother turned tyrant. Sitting alone in her mansion, glass of wine untouched beside her, she stared at the stack of photos her investigators had gathered. Elise walking her son to school, Elise wiping counters in the diner, Elise clutching the child to her chest outside the graveyard. The boy's face, captured in one of the photographs as he looked directly at the camera, stared back at her with eyes too familiar, too close to the son she had buried. It was more than she could bear. She told herself she wasn't just acting out of grief, but out of duty. That boy belonged to her son's legacy, to her family's name. He couldn't be left in the hands of a waitress drowning in poverty. Every rational thought slipped away, replaced by a storm of anger and desperation. She made a call, her voice steady despite her shaking hands, summoning the men who owed her favors, the ones who could solve problems without leaving trails. Elise had just tucked her boy into bed when the knock came. It wasn't polite. It wasn't soft. It was hard, deliberate, and it rattled the thin door of her apartment. Her heart thudded. She wasn't expecting anyone. She moved quietly, peering through the small peephole, and her stomach dropped. Two men stood outside, suits soaked from the rain, their eyes cold. Something in her knew instantly. They weren't here for conversation. She whispered to her son to stay quiet, stay in bed, no matter what. But the child, sensing her fear, began to cry softly. The sound broke her. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands, trying to dial, but before she could press send, the door crashed inward. The apartment was filled with chaos. The men pushed past her, their heavy bodies crowding the small space. Elise screamed, her voice piercing the night, but no neighbors came. Her son sobbed from the bed, his tiny hands covering his ears. She fought with everything she had, scratching, kicking, biting, but they were stronger. One pinned her against the wall, his hand pressing hard over her mouth, the other moving toward the boy. In that moment, Elise's mind split in two. One part was consumed by fear, the other by a wild animal instinct. She lunged forward, breaking free just enough to grab the lamp from the nightstand and swing. It shattered against the man's shoulder, glass exploding across the room. He stumbled, cursing, while the boy screamed louder. The other man pulled something from his coat, a knife, its blade catching the dim light. Time slowed. Elise could hear her own heartbeat, the rain pounding against the thin window, her son's sobs like echoes inside her skull. She thought of the promises her lover had whispered to her in the dark, the way he had pressed his hand over her belly when their son was still inside her. She thought of how hard she had fought to keep him safe, how much she had given up. And in that moment, she knew. No one would take him. Not alive. The struggle turned savage. Elise clawed for the knife, her fingers slick with blood. She couldn't tell whether I was hers or theirs. The child cried out her name, and the sound fueled her. She wrenched the blade free in a surge of strength she didn't know she had, and without thought, without hesitation, she drove it forward. Once. Twice. Again. The man gasped, his breath wet and ragged, before collapsing hard against the floorboards. The other man lunged, but Elise spun, wild with terror, the blade still in her grip. She slashed, catching his cheek, drawing a deep red line. He staggered, startled, and for a brief moment she saw something break in him, a flicker of doubt. He backed away, muttering curses, and bolted for the door, leaving his partner bleeding on the floor. The room went silent except for Elise's ragged breaths and her son's cries. Her hands shook violently, the knife clattering from her grip. She sank to her knees, staring at the man lying motionless, blood pooling beneath him. The metallic scent filled the air, thick and suffocating. Her son crawled into her lap, his tiny arms clinging around her neck. She wanted to comfort him, to whisper it would be all right, but the words wouldn't come. Panic set in. She looked around the apartment, the broken door, the blood, the glass scattered everywhere. She knew what this meant. No one would believe her. They would say she was unstable, that she had killed out of rage, that she wasn't fit to raise her child. And if the billionaire had sent these men, then the story would never be hers to tell. She dragged the man's body toward the door, her strength failing with every inch. Blood smeared across the linoleum, streaks marking every desperate pull. She thought of calling the police, but fear screamed louder. They would side with her. They always did. Elise's mind spiraled, clinging only to one thought: protect the boy. Across town, the billionaire waited for the call that never came. Hours passed, and her anger twisted into unease. When one of the men finally appeared at her door, his face pale and torn, she knew something had gone wrong. He spoke in broken sentences. Blood, knife, the other one dead. Her heart raced, but she forced her face to remain still. She dismissed him with money, her mind already spinning. This could not get out. For Elise, the night stretched endlessly. She sat with her son in her lap, both of them trembling, the bodies still lying in the hallway. Her mind raced through every possibility, running, hiding, confessing. But none seemed safe. Her boy fell asleep against her chest, his small breaths uneven, and she knew she had crossed a line she could never return from. The crime was not neat, not planned the way the billionaire had wanted. It was raw, desperate, born out of fear and love, tangled into something unrecognizable. Blood stained Elise's hands, the kind of stain that didn't wash off, not really. And though she had saved her son that night, she also knew she had opened a door to something far darker, something she could never fully escape. The morning after the blood was spilled, the city seemed unchanged. Cars rushed through wet streets, people hurried to work, and neon signs blinked as if nothing had happened. But inside Elise's small apartment, time felt suspended. The body was gone, dragged away in the dead of night by hands she never saw, but the stain it left was everywhere. The linoleum floor still held streaks that she could not scrub out, no matter how raw her hands became. Her son sat quietly in the corner, clutching a toy car, his wide eyes darting to her every move. He didn't speak of what he had seen, but the silence itself was unbearable. Elise told herself she had done what she had to. She replayed the moment in her mind again and again, trying to believe that any mother would have fought the way she did. But the image of the man collapsing, his breath gurgling as blood spread across her floor, refused to fade. When she closed her eyes, it was all she saw. She started avoiding mirrors, because each time she caught her reflection, her face seemed like someone else's. A stranger's face, marked by fear and something darker. She burned the clothes she wore that night, stuffing them into a trash bag and taking them out into the alley. The smoke carried through the air as she stood watching, shaking, her son clutching her hand. "Don't be scared, Mommy," he whispered once, his little voice trembling. She wanted to tell him she wasn't, but the lie caught in her throat. Across the city, the billionaire sat in her glass-walled office, pretending the world was still under her control. She spoke to her lawyers, attended meetings, even smiled for photographs. But inside, she was unraveling. The man who had died was not some faceless shadow. He had been one of hers. His absence would raise questions. His family would want answers. She tried to convince herself that Elise had gone too far, that the blood wasn't on her own hands, but the guilt pressed against her like a weight she couldn't lift. At night, she wandered the mansion alone, wineglass in hand, her son's photograph clutched against her chest. She whispered to him as if he were still alive, telling him she had tried, that she only wanted to protect his child. But even as she said it, she knew the truth. It had never been just about protection. It had been about power, about control. And now, the blood that soaked Elise's floor was hers to carry too, even if no court could prove it. The media caught wind of something soon enough. A man, known to have ties with powerful circles, was missing. His car was found abandoned on a dark street, his phone left behind. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered of mob ties, others of debts unpaid, but a few looked deeper. Reporters began circling Elise's neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions about the commotion that night. Neighbors remembered the shouting, the crash of a door, the screams. One woman swore she saw a shadow fleeing into the rain. Another whispered that Elise's boy had been crying for hours. Elise tried to keep her head down, but her life shrank to the size of her apartment. She stopped working shifts at the diner, too afraid to leave her son alone. Bills piled up, friends stopped visiting. Her mother looked at her with searching eyes, asking questions Elise couldn't answer. The weight of the secret pressed down on her until she barely slept, pacing the apartment at night while her son clutched his blanket in restless dreams. The billionaire felt the shift too. Her name, once untouchable, began to carry whispers of scandal. The press noticed her sudden silences, her absence from events she had once commanded. Headlines began to question whether grief had driven her too far. Old enemies surfaced, eager to tarnish her reputation, and though no one could prove her link to the crime, the suspicion alone was enough to stain her. The community took sides. Some pitied her, a mother who had lost everything, only trying to keep hold of the last piece of her son. Others despised her, calling her greedy, heartless, and willing to crush a struggling woman just to keep her empire intact. Elise, meanwhile, was painted as both victim and villain, sympathetic for her poverty and loss, but now shadowed by rumors of violence. The story spread like wildfire. The billionaire and the waitress, two women bound by a child and a grave, tearing each other apart. The boy, too young to understand the full weight of it, carried his own scars. He woke at night screaming, his small body trembling as Elise held him close. He stopped speaking in school, staring at his teachers with wary eyes. Sometimes, when he saw a man in a suit, he clung to his mother's hand until his knuckles turned white. He didn't remember everything, but he remembered enough. The shouting, the fear, the blood. Elise tried to shield him, but her own strength frayed. She felt trapped, hunted by shadows even in daylight. Every knock on the door sent her heart racing. Every phone call made her hands shake. She knew she couldn't carry this forever, but confessing meant losing him, and losing him was unthinkable. The billionaire faced her own demons in silence. Alone in her mansion, she began to see her son's face in every corner. Sometimes she swore she heard his voice laughing down the hallway, calling out for her. She knew it wasn't real, but she clung to it anyway, because without it, there was only emptiness. She tried to tell herself she had done what any mother would, that she had fought to protect her grandson's future. But the truth clawed at her, and in the quiet of the night, she admitted to herself that the war between her and Elise had destroyed far more than it had saved. The crime didn't just fracture two women's lives. It rippled outward, staining everything it touched. Families whispered, friends drifted away, strangers judged from afar. What had begun as grief and love had curdled into violence and fear, leaving behind a wound that would never heal. And in the silence after, when the shouting and the blood and the panic had faded, What remained was something harder to face, the emptiness of loss, the shadows of guilt, and the knowledge that no amount of money, no amount of fighting could bring back what had been taken the moment the grave was filled. The weeks turned into months, and though the storm that night had ended, its echoes continued to haunt everyone tied to the tragedy. The police never fully closed the file. There were too many questions left hanging, too many details that didn't fit neatly into the official story. They labelled the billionaire's death an accident brought on by poor weather and a fall in the cemetery. But behind closed doors, investigation, gators whispered about the waitress, about the child, about the chance encounter that tied their worlds together. For the waitress, each passing day was a battle against both the world outside and the storm inside her. She lived in constant fear that someone would knock on her door with questions she couldn't answer, that her son would slip and reveal too much, that her own guilt would spill out in a moment of weakness. Yet no handcuffs came, no courtroom awaited her. Instead, she carried her prison inside herself. Her guilt was a sentence harsher than anything the law could hand down. She aged in ways that had nothing to do with years. Her eyes dulled, her laughter faded. Her body carried the weight of sleepless nights and secrets too heavy to speak. Her son grew, though not untouched. He carried with him memories of that night, images blurred by rain but sharp in his heart. He struggled with trust, with anger, with the quiet knowledge that something about his life was wrong. He loved his mother, but he also feared her silences, the way she flinched at shadows, the way she told him over and over never to speak of the woman at the grave. For him, childhood ended in that cemetery. He would never again be only a boy. He was forever the child caught between two women, one alive but broken, one dead but unyielding. On the other side, the billionaire's family clung to their grief in public, while in private, they devoured one another. Lawsuits over her estate piled up, siblings accused one another of scheming for control, and board members clashed over the future of her empire. The question of an illegitimate grandchild hovered like smoke, never confirmed, never denied, but impossible to ignore. Some wanted to erase the rumor, to bury it along with her body. Others wanted to use it as a weapon, proof that even the most powerful were vulnerable to secrets. The public, always hungry for spectacle, divided itself into camps. Some mourned the billionaire as a woman who built an empire from steel and willpower, a figure of ambition and strength. Others whispered about her coldness, her control, her obsession with power, and said perhaps her end was fitting, alone, broken, beside the grave of the son she could never fully protect. And then some turned their eyes to the waitress. She became a symbol of everything society wanted to argue about: race, class, wealth, and injustice. Some painted her as a victim, left behind by a system that chews up women like her. Others saw her as dangerous, a manipulator who wanted to claw her way into a world she didn't belong to. But in the end, no verdict came. There was no trial, no jury, no verdict of guilty or not guilty. Justice, at least the kind people imagine with gavels and prisons, never arrived. Instead, the punishment was quieter, more insidious. It was in the way people looked at the waitress when she walked into a room. It was in the way her son carried a silence that children should never know. It was in the way the billionaire's name, once untouchable, now came with whispers of scandal. Looking back, the crime revealed more than the death itself. It exposed the fragile threads that hold together the illusion of control, the thin line between power and vulnerability, between wealth and ruin. It showed how grief can twist into rage, how love can sour into obsession, how two women, so different yet bound by the same man, could destroy each other in their desperate fight to hold on to what mattered. There were no real winners. The billionaire lost her life. The waitress lost her patience. The child lost his innocence. The city lost another illusion, another reminder that money cannot protect anyone from the darker corners of human nature. Society clung to the story because it reflects it. Truths too uncomfortable to ignore. It showed how power shapes perception, how a wealthy woman's death could dominate headlines, while the struggles of a poor mother were reduced to rumor and suspicion. It highlighted the imbalance of justice, the way guilt and innocence are often decided not by facts, but by status. It forced people to confront the question of what it means to protect family and how far someone will go when pushed to the edge. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the city faded and the cemetery stood silent again, the story felt less like a crime and more like a tragedy. Two women, each carrying unbearable pain, collided in a storm that neither could survive intact. One lost her life. The other lost herself. The child, the innocent thread between them, grew up carrying both their ghosts. In the end, justice was not a gavel or a prison cell. Justice was the truth that neither woman could escape, that love and power, grief and rage, wealth and poverty, all of them can collide in ways that destroy everything. And sometimes, the most devastating crimes are not the ones punished by law, but the ones that leave behind scars no verdict can heal. The graveyard remained as it always was, rows of marble, damp earth, and flowers left by trembling hands. But for those tied to the night of the storm, it was no longer just a place of mourning. It was a reminder of how quickly lives can unravel, how thin the line is between dignity and ruin, and how the echoes of one night can haunt generations. And as the boy grew into a man, he carried the truth that defined his life, that his story began with two women who loved and hated in equal measure, and with a storm that would never truly end.